This video introduces the Koine Greek imperfect and aorist active indicative verbs. As always, when we come to verbs, I'm going to repeat myself once again and tell you that Greek is a highly inflected language. Greek changes the form of words, both nouns and verbs, based on the grammatical function and form of that word in a given sentence. So far, with respect to Greek verbs, we've seen this a whole lot with person and number. We've seen present and future active indicative verbs of different person and number, and we've seen it a little bit with tense with respect to the present and future being in different forms. Remember, the future tense is formed by the sigma tense formative stuck in the middle of the word. And now this week we're going to see it with the changes that are made with respect to the imperfect and the aorist tenses in the active voice and the indicative mood. So here we are. In blue are those tenses we've already had so far in this course. And then in red here, the imperfect and the aorist, the two tenses that we're introducing in this video. What I want to do first is talk about the different meaning and translation of different tense verbs, and especially with respect to their action. So with the present active indicative, we have verbs that are communicating, generally speaking, something that has happened or is happening in present time. The present tense in Greek does not differentiate between continuous or simple action. As I have told you before in this course, you can translate the present active indicative with the continuous I am releasing or with the simple form I release. And the way that I sort of visualize these in my mind is that the continuous action is 2 points wherein the action was happening between them. So in present time, the action is happening. It's ongoing. Whereas the simple action is viewed as a whole. It's just simply viewed sort of as a point. I release. There's nothing said about the ongoing nature or how long the action was taking place. It just happens simply in present time. The future tense is the exact same, that there is no difference as to action in the future tense, that the future active indicative can indicate continuous action in the translation I will be releasing, or simple action, I will release. With the two different tenses that we are introducing today, there is in fact a distinction between the kind of action. So both the imperfect and the aorist are going to, generally speaking, refer to action in past time, that these are past tense verbs. The imperfect is going to be continuous action in past time. That is, it's going to be this kind of action where the action is ongoing. So I was releasing. It was an ongoing action in the past time. Whereas the aorist active indicative is going to be this simple punctiliar action where the action is just viewed as a whole, as an I release. Nothing is being said about the duration of the action when it comes to the aorist tense. And so we also need to talk about the formation of the imperfect and the aorist because they are going to be formed different. So they're going to look different, and that's going to let you know whether you translate the action as past and ongoing or past and simple. So we have seen these changes before, these inflections, because Greek is a highly inflected language. The present tense uses its stem, it adds a connecting vowel, and those primary active suffixes that you memorized back in week 2 of the course. The future active indicative is formed very similarly, except for that sigma is stuck in between the stem and the connecting vowel. So that the present active indicative and the future active indicative look very similar to one another, besides the fact that the future has this sigma that is characteristic of it. When it comes to the imperfect active indicative, we have something new that we have not yet seen in this class, and that is a prefix that is added to the beginning of the word. So if a suffix means something that comes at the end, a prefix is something that comes at the beginning. And in this case, it is what is called an augment. Usually you will see the augment as an epsilon. We'll talk about other forms of the augment in just a moment here, but it is stuck on the word before the stem, the verbal stem, and then you have the connecting vowel, and then you have the secondary suffixes that are added after the connecting vowel. And these secondary suffixes are going to be one of the two things that you need to memorize from this video and from lesson 7 of Black's grammar, that you'll see that both the imperfect and the aorist are going to be built on these secondary suffixes, or they're going to use, each is going to use these secondary suffixes. So when it comes to the aorist, we have something very similar going on. You have the augment. So the augment is going to be our clue that we are in past time, since both the imperfect and the aorist indicate past time. Then just like the imperfect, the aorist is going to use a stem. And what's going to be different about the aorist, the first aorist anyway, we'll talk about the second aorist in just a second. The first aorist is going to use an aorist morpheme, and this morpheme is sigma, alpha, or saw, with the secondary suffixes added on to that saw. So when you see a saw in the middle of a word, followed by these secondary suffixes, you know you are in the first aorist tense, and the action is simple or viewed as a single point. So I said we're going to talk more about the augment. The usual augment that you will see, probably 75% of the time, is an epsilon at the beginning of the verb for aorist and imperfect tense verbs. And the epsilon is going to be there if the verb begins with a consonant. So for example, our most basic verb, luo, that we have been building our paradigms on for this class, luo changes to eluon in the imperfect. Notice there's no saw in there. And it changes to elusaw in the first aorist. Notice we do have the saw there. And in both of these cases, the augment is an epsilon because the verb stem begins with the consonant lambda. The second form of the augment is a corresponding long vowel. So if you see a long vowel like eta or omega at the beginning of a verb, there's a good chance that it has been augmented from its corresponding short vowel. So if a verb stem begins with a short vowel, the augment of that verb will appear by a lengthening of the short vowel. So an alpha and an epsilon will augment to an eta, and an omicron, little o, omicron, will augment to big O, omega. When it comes to diphthongs, alpha iota and epsilon iota will augment to an eta, and the iota will subscript. So what's happened essentially is these vowels have lengthened just as they do over here. They've augmented to the long form eta, and when the long form eta has been formed, that sort of allows the iota to go under it, to subscript. And then if we have, if a verb stem begins with an alpha hoopsilon or an epsilon hoopsilon, once again, we'll have the lengthening to an eta, but the hoopsilon doesn't subscript. There's no hoopsilon subscript, so it will stay in line with the eta there. So the lengthening is indicated by the eta. And our third form of the augment is going to be no change at all. This is what's called a zero augment. And you'll see this particularly when the verb stem begins with a long vowel, like epsilon or omega, or a long diphthong. And so these are one of the more, this is the sort of trickiest augment insofar as the verb stem is not going to look any different from what it looks like in the present tense. And you'll have to recognize the imperfect or the aorist from other things inside the verb itself, from the saw or from the endings of the verb. And so speaking of those endings and those forms, this is what the imperfect and the first aorist active indicative are going to look like, given what we've noted about how they're formed with those secondary endings stuck onto them. So eluon, elues, elue, eluamen, elueti, eluan for the imperfect active indicative. And notice here, eluan is used for both the first person singular and the third person plural. So the only way you're going to know if it's a they or an I doing the action in the imperfect active indicative is by the context of the sentence itself, figuring out if the subject is an I or if the subject is a they. And then down here with our first aorist, you see the saw in there in all of these except for in the sin. This is because no ending is used here. Per the secondary endings that I showed you earlier. And so instead of it just being saw again, to make sure it doesn't look like the first person singular, it's changed to an epsilon and also uses that movable nu there that will appear if the next word begins with a vowel. And the only other thing to note, we need to hearken back to amalgamation, which we talked about a few weeks ago when we introduced the future tense. Remember that sigma does not like to stand next to other letters, that certain changes will happen when a sigma comes into contact with certain letters. So we saw this with respect to the sigma tense formative of the future tense. And this is also going to happen when the sa morpheme of the aorist comes in contact with certain stem endings that end in these letters over here. So what we're going to do here is a quick practice hearkening back to amalgamation from a couple weeks ago. As always, I'm going to ask you to first make guesses on all 6 of these. So write them down on your whiteboard, what the sort of math problem, the algebra problem combination is going to result in right here. Do your best. And then I'll give you a little bit of help after you unpause the lecture and have made some guesses here. And so here is your help, your little sort of algebraic cheat sheet as to amalgamation. Go ahead and check yourself and correct yourself here. So your answers should look something like this after you have self-corrected. The other aorist that we need to note. So we've been talking about the first aorist so far, and we've simply referred to it as the aorist, and that is what Black's grammar is going to do because it's the most common aorist. Some grammars will differentiate and always call the aorist that we just introduced the first aorist, and the aorist that we're just about to talk about now, the second aorist. So the second aorist is different from the first aorist as to its form. The first aorist is characterized by the sa morpheme. And so I think of this, my sort of mnemonic for remembering first aorist is the sa morpheme. Sa occurs in the first aorist. The second aorist does not use the sa morpheme and rather changes its verb form. This is what in grammar is called a strong verb, where a verb will change its root or change its form in the past tense. So we do this in English often as well. So the present tense go changes completely to another word went. It is a strong past tense verb. This is what the second aorist is in Greek, when a change occurs to the root of the present tense when a verb goes to the past tense. And so what is going to happen is that second aorists, their endings are also going to use those secondary suffixes that you are being asked to memorize for this week. And as a result, they look very similar to the imperfect as their form because they don't have the sa morpheme and they use those secondary endings that the imperfect uses. So despite the fact that they look like the imperfect, they're translated with the simple past, with that single point in time. The action is viewed as a whole simply. So they are translated like what we saw with the first aorist, but they look like, as to their endings, the imperfect. And so the way that the second aorist active indicatives are formed is the augment, usually in the form of epsilon, and then the changed stem, the altered verbal stem with the secondary suffixes. So the second aorist, again, translated as the first aorist. So there is no difference in meaning between the first aorist and the second aorist. The only difference is in form. And so, as I told you that the second aorist is going to look like the imperfect as to its ending. So I give you examples here, and these are taken directly from Black's grammar, of lapo in the second aorist. Notice that the stem has changed from lape with the epsilon iota to lip with just a iota. And then these secondary endings are used. So the endings of the imperfect are identical, but the imperfect retains the epsilon iota. The imperfect is built on the present tense stem. The present tense stem hasn't changed at all. It's just added that augment, used the secondary suffixes, whereas the second aorist has changed the form, added the augment, and added the secondary suffixes. So once again, the second aorist is less common than the first aorist, but there are a lot of very important verbs that are going to have second aorist forms. Usually a Greek verb is going to have a first aorist or a second aorist. There are some Greek verbs that will have both a first aorist form and a second aorist form. That is to say, you'll see the aorist will look two different ways for certain verbs. But the thing for you to know and to memorize is from the vocabulary list, is that the vocabulary flashcards and the vocabulary from Black is going to ask you to memorize either the first aorist form or the second aorist form of a given verb. So you'll have, for example, on the flashcards, you'll have the second aorist form on the front of the flashcard, and on the back of it, it'll be the translation, I did whatever in the past tense, and in parentheses, it'll say second aorist of whatever the present tense is. And so you should be able to recognize that a verb is the second aorist from those flashcards. So when you do the flashcards, don't just do the translation, but also note when you do them, note mentally, or if you speak the flashcards out loud, note that you have a second aorist form. And so the last thing that we want to do here, and the other paradigm that you are going to be asked to memorize from this video and from this lesson, is the imperfect indicative of eİmī. So that's this paradigm over here. You have already memorized the present indicative of eİmī earlier in this class. And you'll notice that the two things that you're asked to memorize for this week, namely these secondary active suffixes and the imperfect indicative of eİmī, they look very similar to one another. So the imperfect indicative of eİmī is going to use this eta as its root. So you can put a little line under the eta in each of these. And then it adds the secondary suffix endings mostly pretty regularly. So there are exceptions with amen. So notice that that the new suffix down here is not at play in this men up here, and that's because of the third person singular. It uses the movable new, so they didn't want these two to look identical to one another, so this is why the men has come in there. But otherwise, you see the sigma reflected of the sigma down here. This new is from the movable new, and the men is the same as the men in the suffix. The te is the same as the te in the suffix, and the son is the same as one of the two secondary endings here. So these are the things that you need to memorize for this week. And what we're going to do now is a little bit of practice speaking these imperfect forms as sort of that chanting style of trying to hammer these into your brains. So what we'll do is I'll go through these and speak them and give you just a second right after me to speak each one. So after I say each word, I ask that you say it out loud as well. So we have amen, ace, ain. Amen, eti, eison. And again, amen, eis, ein, amen, ete, eison. And one more time. Amen, eis, ein, amen, eti, eison. And now I want you to see if you can, having taken away these imperfect indicative forms of eİmī and having said them, and if you want to sort of go back about 30 or 45 seconds and do that again or a couple of times, that might be a good thing for you to do. But what I want you to do is fill out on your whiteboard. Remember, you can make a simple little chart like this on your whiteboard and fill in these forms of eİmī in the imperfect indicative. And so you should have found that it looks like this. Amen, eis, ein, amen, ete, eison. And we're going to speak these one more time, and the next time that I ask you to write, we're going to take away this help over here. So both of these will be blank, and we'll see if you can fill in both of them, both of the things that you are being asked to memorize from this video and from lesson 7 of Black's Grammar. So let's say these together 3 times again. Amen, eis, ein, amen, ete, eison. And again. Amen, eis, ein, amen, ete, eison. And last time. Amen, eis, ein, amen, ete, eison. All right, and now we have taken away both the imperfect indicative paradigm here and also the secondary suffix endings. See if you can fill these in here. So it should look like this. You can self-correct for a second here if this is not what you had. And then we are going to move on to some practice. We're going to do 2 different sentences here. The first one is going to ask you a couple questions and ask you to translate the sentence. You'll probably find fairly quickly that this is one that is quite familiar to you from the New Testament. So go ahead and pause the lecture here. And what I want you to do is figure out what the indicative verbs in the sentence are. Remember, that's the first thing I always advise you to do. And then find out what the subjects of those verbs are, what case they are in, and then finally translate the sentence. And here are some helps for you if you had any trouble with any parts of this. So I've given you here the imperfect indicative paradigm, and I have given you the different noun endings. And so to give us some answers to these things here, so our main indicative verbs in the sentence are going to be, it's going to be the same verb repeated 2 times, once in each clause. And remember, when you have 2 verbs in different clauses, you can sort of divide out the different clauses, usually based on a punctuation mark. So here we have a comma or a half stop, so we can take these group by group. And what we find, so our verbs are ein, and we're going to be looking for a nominative subject of this verb, and it's going to be ha logos. So this os ending corresponds over here to the nominative masculine singular, and we get that also in the definite article ha, which is nominative masculine singular. And so we have with this, the sort of core of our sentence, the word, logos's word, was, and then we need to figure out what the word was. And so one of the things to note about this lesson, to note about to be verbs, is that to be verbs can link two different parts of a sentence, or so they can conjoin two different nominatives or a nominative with another thing in the sentence, or they can just stand on their own as what is called a stative verb. And that's what we have here. This is just saying the word was, or the word existed. And then the additional part of our sentence here, this in arche, is going to be a prepositional phrase telling us when the word was, or when the word existed. And of course, the word existed in the beginning. So arche here, if we look over to our noun endings, this eta with a iota subscript tells us we have a dative feminine singular, and that's exactly what arche is. It's a feminine noun meaning beginning. So in the beginning, in English, we'd like to put in the definite article there. Remember, the use or non-use of the definite article in Greek doesn't directly correspond to what we find in English. So in the beginning was the word. And then we move on to our second bit here. And we're going to look for a subject for our other was, our other ein, the imperfect indicative of eİmī in the third person singular. And we get it in, again, ha logos, the same exact phrase. And then we have, in this case, the to be verb linking two different nominatives. So notice how theos, this os ending, just like the os ending of logos, is a nominative masculine singular. So in this case, you can think of the to be verb sort of as an equal sign, with one of the two nominatives as the subject and the other of the two nominatives as what is called a predicate. So in this case, the subject is going to be ha logos, and there are reasons and rules for how you determine which is the subject and which is the object. I don't want to confuse you too much and get into those rules, but the presence of the article with the logos is what tips us off that this one is the subject, and so it's going to come first. The word was, and then God is what is called the predicate. It is the thing that is predicated or said about the word. So, and the word was God. And one more here. Once again, start with no helps. Do your best at going at a translation here. Most of these words should be familiar to you from the vocabulary. There's actually only one in here that you should need vocabulary help with, and it's one that you've seen in this video. So go ahead and see what you can do by way of a translation of this without any helps first. So go ahead and pause the lecture. And now I've given you some helps here. A couple different things. I've given you the definite article paradigm in its entirety. I've given you the imperfect active indicative paradigm here. I've given you the first aorist active indicative paradigm here. And I've given you once again the noun ending. So with these helps, see if you can correct yourself or fill in some of the gaps as you pause the lecture. And so what we're going to do here is, as always, look for verbs. We get one in elipon, and this is going to be it's going to be, in this paradigm, the imperfect active indicative. And the on ending tells us it's either going to be first person singular or it's going to be third person plural. So we're going to be looking for something in the singular or the plural as our subject here. And we get it in the next word, hoi pone roi. So this hoi we know is the nominative masculine plural definite article, and it's going to tell us that this is nominative masculine plural. And a quick question for you, if you have not recognized this already, this is an adjective. And so the definite article is telling us that it's a particular use of the adjective. Can you remember which use of the adjective this is? So this is a substantival adjective where the adjective is functioning as the noun itself. So the evil ones leave. So lepo. And excuse me, I told you that this is an imperfect indicative. That is not accurate. This is a second aorist. Because remember, the imperfect is built on the present stem. So if this was an imperfect, it would look like this. Elapon with the epsilon in there. But because the epsilon is gone, it has changed its verbal root. And it's changed its verbal root because it's a second aorist, and that's what second aorists do. The epsilon here is our augment, telling us we have past tense. So the evil ones left. So simple action. If it were imperfect, it would be were leaving. But because it's second aorist simple actions, it's the evil ones left. So that's our first clause here. And then we have another verb in our second clause, epistiuson. And so this is going to be our son ending. And we notice here that we have an augment at the beginning. So this is going to tell us we have past tense, either imperfect or aorist. And then the son is going to let us know that it's aorist because we have that saw in there. And with the son ending, it's going to be third person plural from the verb pistuo, which we were introduced to a couple weeks ago. So they all did not believe. So in the simple past tense, did not believe. And then we need to figure out who it all, or sorry, there's no not here. They all believed. So we need to figure out who it was that believed, the they. And it's going to be here with our nominative masculine plural hoi agathoi. Once again, we have a substantival adjective. The adjective agathos in the nominative masculine plural is the noun itself. So the good ones believed. And then the object of our sentence is ta euangelion. So this ta could, by its form, be a neuter nominative singular, or it could be a neuter nominative accusative. But because we already have a subject, we know that it's going to be an accusative. It's going to be the object of the verb they believed. And then right here we have this conjunction that indicates contrast. In English, the word but. So to put it all together, our first clause is the evil ones left, but the good ones believed the gospel.